Mnangagwa government sanctions lies exposed. U.S. Ambassador to Zimbabwe Brian Nichols speaks out. United States U.S. Ambassador to Zimbabwe Brian Nichols has dismissed government claims that Western sanctions were behind the country's economic meltdown, saying the hemorrhage was being fueled by high-profile corruption, economic mismanagement, policy inconsistency and failure to respect human rights, among other vices. In an opinion piece exclusively written for Newsday, Nichols said those vices were holding the country back. His statement comes as government has declared, Friday, a public holiday to campaign for the unconditional lifting of the sanctions. Government claims sanctions were blocking lines of credit and trade. Said countries have also pledged to observe the day in solidarity with Harare, to pressure the European Union and US to lift the sanctions which were imposed following gross human rights abuses and electoral fraud during the late former President Robert Mugabe's rule. The US government in March this year extended the sanctions by a year, saying they would only be lifted after President Emmerson Mnangagwa has honored his reform pledge. Blaming sanctions as a convenient scapegoat to distract the public from the real reasons behind Zimbabwe's economic challenges, corruption, economic mismanagement, and failure to respect human rights and uphold the rule of law, Nichols said. What then is holding Zimbabwe back? It's not sanctions. There are only 141 Zimbabwean people and companies on the US sanctions list. That's right, just 141, in a country of 16 million. They are on the list for good reason. He added, there is no U.S. trade embargo on Zimbabwe. American companies are interested in investing in Zimbabwe, but are deterred by the massive levels of corruption, economic uncertainty, and weak rule of law. So, investors turn to other promising opportunities in the region and wait for the country to embrace the political and economic reforms that would make it a more attractive destination. Nichols said the greatest sanctions on Zimbabwe were the limitations the country was imposing on itself. Nichols said Zimbabwe is ranked 160 out of 175 nations on Transparency International's corruption list. The U.S. envoy chronicled a lot of corrupt activities by government fat cats, including the missing US $2.8 million earmarked for the Command Agriculture Program, and had American companies were unceremoniously elbowed out of the Dima Power project after winning the tender in 2016 and replaced by Secunda Holdings. He also cited scandals at the Zimbabwe National Road Authority and CISA Holdings, where millions of dollars could not be accounted for. Corruption is at the heart of why Zimbabweans are suffering through prolonged power outages. It's not sanctions. It's a betrayal of the public trust, Nichols charged. He declared that Zimbabwe loses more than US $1 billion per year to corruption, which is a huge figure considering that the country's entire economy is just around US $26 billion. He said if government was serious about fighting corruption, the country's laws should be applied evenly and enforced. If the government managed to do that, then state coffers would be full and the economy humming, he further averred. The U.S. envoy said Mnangagwa's administration must also resolve several reports of abductions and human rights violations recorded in the past few months. Meanwhile, Newsday yesterday gathered that government had extended a begging bowl to the corporate sector and well-wishers to fund its ambitious anti-sanctions march penciled for tomorrow, and commandeered all students not sitting for public examinations and staff to organize own transport to the venues. Teachers who spoke on condition of anonymity claimed that government had ordered all pupils not writing public examinations to attend the national and provincial anti-sanctions marches without fail. SANU-PF structures, meanwhile, have been moving around the country soliciting for financial support to fund the campaign, which is expected to gobble at least $4 million. In an undated letter signed by one Tibito on behalf of Chipinge State Occasions Committee, members of the Chipinge Dairy Farmers Association were asked to provide diesel to transport people to Chipinge for the march, while several provinces, including Harare, have received similar requests. Chipinge District has taken a stance to support the Solidarity March, whose main event will be in Harare, with a similar one being held in Chipinge. Part of the letter on a local government ministry letterhead read, "In view of the above, we have been assigned as the District Fundraising Committee subcommittee to mobilize diesel for vehicles to ferry members of Chipinge community to the historical event. The letter added, "We thus unite to request for your support in providing the committee with diesel-to-fuel vehicles that will transport people to the event." In Harare, Primary and Secondary Education Secretary Tuma Sankabela wrote to Provincial Education Director Christopher Katira on October 15, advising that government had requested the release of about 304 students and teachers for mass display performances at the main anti-sanctions march. "You are requested to ensure availability of the learners and their teachers for this important government event without disrupting examinations that are already underway." Teachers' unions also leaked a WhatsApp message that was also ordering schools to release general hand staff for the anti-sanctions march, with the respective schools expected to foot their transport and food bills. Information Deputy Minister Energy Mutoti yesterday said teachers were civil servants and obliged to support government work. The anti-sanction is a state event and public service has the right to compel teachers to attend. "It is not a partisan event, it is a national event," Mutoti said. "It is ignorance, or the lack of understanding by those teachers, and I doubt their credentials. These are state events, and they are required to participate." Teachers have been advocating for the higher salaries and government has not been able to pay them because of those sanctions. Bad news for Mnangagwa. U.S. President Trump government hits top ZANU-PF government official with sanctions. The United States on Friday placed Zimbabwe's State Security Minister Owen Ncube under targeted financial and travel sanctions on the same day that the Zimbabwe government organized countrywide marches to denounce restrictive measures on 141 other individuals and entities. United States Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, in a statement, said, "Today, I publicly designated Owen Ncube for his involvement in a gross violation of human rights in Zimbabwe. State-sanctioned violence in Zimbabwe must end now, and those responsible for human rights violations must be held accountable." The listing of Ncube signals United States frustration over the lack of accountability in the killings of innocent civilians in August last year and January this year, as well as ongoing abductions of opposition activists and unionists by state security agents. There was no immediate response by Zimbabwe's government to the announcement, which is likely to bring fresh anger from the regime, which on Friday declared a public holiday to press for the lifting of the sanctions in poorly attended marches across the country. The decision to announce the designation of Ncube on the same day as the anti-sanctions demonstrations will be read as a strong signal from President Donald Trump's administration that the lobby for the lifting of sanctions has no takers in Washington. On the eve of Friday's demonstrations, United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee Chairman Senator Jim Risch, R. Idaho, said Mnangagwa's government was distorting facts about the sanctions regime to deflect from its failures. Responsibility for the current political and economic crisis in Zimbabwe falls solely on the ruling regime that has governed the country for decades. If Zimbabwe's leaders put as much time, financial resources, and effort into delivering on their long-promised reforms as they have in distorting facts and organizing anti-sanctions campaigns, Zimbabweans would not continue to suffer under the dire economic and humanitarian conditions they face today, Risch said. In Harare, Bulawayo, Mutar, Gweru, and Masvingo, the major cities, many stayed away from the anti-sanctions demonstrations, saying they were a distraction from the president's mishandling of the economy, which is plagued by 18-hour daily power cuts and shortages of foreign exchange, fuel and medicines. Mnangagwa has so far failed to unify the country since taking over from the late Robert Mugabe, who was ousted in a coup in 2017. Hopes of a swift recovery have faded as the economy struggles to exit its deepest crisis in a decade. Human rights groups in Zimbabwe say the level of repression after Mnangagwa seized power before claiming a controversial election victory last year has gone up several notches, with over 50 activists having been abducted and tortured by suspected state security agents this year alone. Soldiers were deployed to suppress a protest against delays in announcing results of Zimbabwe's first election without Mugabe on the ballot in July last year. Mnangagwa unleashed the soldiers again to put down protests over sharp fuel price increases in January and February, in a crackdown that left at least 18 people dead. The United States says it has credible information that ONCUB was involved in the recent abductions and denial of the freedom of assembly to the opposition. The State Department has credible information that ONCUB was involved in gross violations of human rights in his capacity as Zimbabwe's Minister of State for National Security, a statement said. We are deeply troubled by the Zimbabwean government's use of state-sanctioned violence against peaceful protesters and civil society, as well as against labor leaders and members of the opposition leaders in Zimbabwe. We urge the government to stop the violence, investigate, and hold accountable officials responsible for human rights violations and abuses in Zimbabwe. The statement added that the United States sanctions target those who engage in corruption, violate human rights, and undermine democratic institutions or processes. State-sanctioned violence creates a culture of impunity for human rights abusers. The United States continues to support the Zimbabwean people in need, especially through humanitarian and health assistance. We will continue to press the government of Zimbabwe to implement necessary political and economic reforms to provide Zimbabwean citizens the prosperity, security, and well-being they deserve. The United States and the European Union, which imposed sanctions almost 2 decades ago over alleged rights abuses, have in recent months issued several statements warning against continued violations. Mnangagwa's government has made the lifting of sanctions a top priority and has held several meetings with senior officials from the United States and the European Union to lobby for that in Zimbabwe's readmission to the Commonwealth. Risch warned regional countries against weighing in on the side of Zimbabwe's kleptocratic government. The ruling party should focus on the needs of the Zimbabwean people instead of their bad governance, corruption, and state capture, he said. Regional institutions should also focus their energies on supporting democracy, not kleptocratic regimes, he added in an apparent reference to the Southern African Development Community, SADC, which has backed Mnangagwa's calls for the lifting of the sanctions. Massive blow for Mnangagwa. President Emmerson Mnangagwa on Friday described Western sanctions as a cancer sapping the economy, and his supporters denounced the measures during marches held around the country. In Harare, Bulawayo, Mutar, Gweru, and Masvingo, the major cities, many stayed away from the demonstrations, saying they were a distraction from the president's mishandling of the economy, which is plagued by 18-hour daily power cuts and shortages of foreign exchange, fuel and medicines. Mnangagwa has so far failed to unify the country since taking over from the late Robert Mugabe, who was ousted in a coup in 2017. Hopes of a swift recovery have faded as the economy struggles to exit its deepest crisis in a decade. Mnangagwa, like Mugabe, blames the sanctions imposed by the United States and European Union since 2001 for the economic ills, and says they are intended to remove his party from power. Every part and sector of our economy has been affected by these sanctions like a cancer, Mnangagwa told a sparse crowd in Harare's 60,000-seater national stadium. Enough is enough, remove them. Remove these sanctions now. The poor attendance showed the difficulties that Mnangagwa faces in mobilizing party members still divided between Mugabe supporters and those who ousted him. The rift was exposed by a bruising dispute over the former leader's funeral. Earlier, government supporters led by Mnangagwa's wife Exilia and bust from across Zimbabwe marched for 5 kilometers to the stadium. Singing and dancing, they waved placards inscribed "No sanctions, no discrimination, sanctions new version of slavery, and enough is enough, remove sanctions now. We have no jobs because of the sanctions. America wants to remove ZANU-PF from power through sanctions, but we will defend the party and our president," said 32-year-old Martin Mafusire. Similar marches were held throughout Zimbabwe after Mnangagwa declared Friday a public holiday. But in downtown Harare, many people went about their daily business selling everything from fruit to mobile phones. The government had offered free chicken and chips meals, free transport, tollgate waivers, and directives targeted at schools and universities in a desperate push to boost the numbers. The country's 2 biggest football clubs, Highlanders and Dynamos, were roped in as well along with popular musicians, but it is Mnangagwa who has to go, because he has failed. "I can't leave my station to go on a useless march," said mother of 3 Catherine Chihota, selling fruit at a street corner. The EU and United States imposed financial and travel bans on ZANU-PF and top military figures for alleged human rights abuses and electoral fraud. The government says the measures are punishment for its seizures of Wida-owned farms. ZANU-PF supporters condemn the sanctions, while the main opposition movement for democratic change says they are not the cause of the country's economic crisis. The regional Southern African Development Community has rallied behind Zimbabwe's call for an end to sanctions. While the government ran documentaries and articles in the official press criticizing sanctions, the U.S. and EU embassies took to social media to rebut the official narrative. U.S. Ambassador Brian Nichols wrote an article in a private newspaper on Thursday saying the greatest sanctions on Zimbabwe are the limitations that the country places on itself. He said the United States remained the biggest donor to Zimbabwe, but corruption and lack of reform had dragged down the economy. The EU keeps some sanctions in place, but in June it began talks with Harare meant to move on from the Mugabe era. Harare says the U.S. sanctions have been the most devastating. These bar U.S. officials at the International Monetary Fund and World Bank from voting for debt relief or fresh lending for Zimbabwe. In March, President Donald Trump extended by 1 year sanctions against 141 entities and individuals in Zimbabwe, including Mnangagwa,